one of the relationships that we've had with China, and just does not apply only to Zambia, but to all African countries, is that China has got into a partnership with Africa under the Forum for Chinese and Africa Cooperation called FOCAC, where China pledged $60 billion for the development of Africa. So clearly, China and Africa, and particularly China and Zambia, have a development agreement where resources were going to be made available for the development of our country. And the focus of this development was primarily targeted towards economic infrastructure. And this is what's been going on over the last 5 to 10 years. We've seen Chinese investments in roads, in hospitals, in schools, of course, in the airports, and also in the stadiums. Maybe some of these investments would have been investments that we could have been a little more smarter about. For example, I don't really see the focus of investment in sports stadiums and football stadiums when other important economic infrastructure is dysfunctional, such as the railway systems. So we could have been a little more discerning with the kind of investment that we wanted to see China support us in our development agenda. But clearly, China has turned out to be a much, much bigger development partner than our traditional development partners, which used to be the World Bank, the IMF, and other Western countries. But China seems to have filled up that space. And so clearly, they turn out to become now the biggest creditors that we have, because most of our loans and agreements would have been signed with the Chinese government. There's been some information shared about debt with China, and most of it has been reflective of the infrastructure development debt that we've seen for the roads and other infrastructure. But when we look at the details, a lot of the detail is not clearly shared with the public, but one can do an analysis by subtracting the debt that we do know. For example, out of Zambia's about $11.2 billion worth of debt, we know that $3 billion is attributed to the international bonds that we issued. The 3 international bonds collectively came to $3 billion. So that brings us to $8 billion worth of debt. And we do know that we have taken debt from the African Development Bank to do some of our bridges, the Kazangula Bridge. We've seen some bilateral debt coming from the World Bank. And I would say possibly between $2 and $3 billion would be attributed to these other financiers. So in my opinion, China's debt is somewhere around $5 billion. Which is definitely the biggest part of the debt that we owe, more like 50% of total debt. I wouldn't use the word predatory because, debt is something that people don't force on anybody. Debt is something that you acquire. You don't get people being bestowed with debt. You always acquire debt. It means you apply for it, and you know what you're doing when you're going for this kind of debt. And for Zambia, we've been doing that since independence. So the word predatory might not be appropriate, but it's significant. And historically, Chinese debt has been cheaper than debt from other institutions such as World Bank and other bilateral partners from the West. So Chinese debt has always kind of been concessionary debt. And we've been able to pay these debts. If you look at historically, the Chinese were involved in building the Tazara railway line. They were involved in developing a lot of our roads into the Western province. So we have been working with China at least for the last 20 or 30 years. And we've seen that we've been able to pay off that debt. In terms of whether this debt is being acquired at an acceptable level. I think that a lot of Chinese debt has built-in moratoriums, allowing us to complete the infrastructure before we start paying off the debt. And as recently as the COVID-19 pandemic, we've seen China come on board offering to reschedule debt. So at the moment, they're not talking about writing off debt, but more about rescheduling it to allow us to use our resources to continue to protect our people from any COVID infections, but at the same time to try to strengthen their already dying economy, if you like, because people are not working, factories are shut down, and so forth. And I think this is a positive step in the Zambia-China relations. We've seen that with other debt that we have out there, the creditors are still wanting us to pay. They're not talking about debt relief of any kind. And China has shown the first signs of a bilateral partner, which is a huge partner to Zambia, offering some kind of debt relief by rescheduling how the payment plan should be. Firstly, my concern is that we seem to have used debt in not the most strategic way. If I look at the $3 billion debt that we got from the bonds, very little of it can be accounted for in terms of economic infrastructure investment. Most of it seems to just have been consumed. And that's always the challenge with debt, that when you take debt and you don't invest it in any investment that's going to have a return, it means that you're just creating debt that you're going to struggle to pay back. And that seems to be the case for us as a nation on the entire $11 billion that we owe. But coming more specifically to China's debt, my concern is that we have taken debt to develop certain infrastructures that don't really have a short to medium term return to the nation. For example, the stadiums. There's a lot of money that's gone into stadiums, but we're certainly not going to make money out of football matches for the foreseeable future. We look at the 3 airports that we've refurbished in Lusaka, Livingston, and Ndola. We have never had enough air traffic coming into Zambia to be able to generate a return on these investments of the airports. So again, it's an infrastructure that's payback period is probably 50 years or more. And I think those were calculated applications of debt. We should have really used this debt to build the railway system from kerosene and petrol for our trucking system. We'd have fewer trucks on the road, which means that we would have less road maintenance. So we'd be saving money from other areas by having economic infrastructure that is serving money in the stuck between a rock and a hard place, as they say. We really have to find a formula that's going to allow us to generate the revenues to be able to service the debt for not only China, but for other partners. If you look at the 2020 national budget, about $23 billion is allocated towards debt servicing. And when you look at a budget of about 80 to 90 billion kwacha, sorry, I said 23 billion kwacha, you're looking at about 30% of our budget going towards debt servicing, and that's pretty huge. It means that there's very little left of the resources in our national budget for building the economy. So it's going to be an uphill battle for the foreseeable future unless we are able to turn things around by really changing the way that we do things. And one of the ways is that as a nation, we produce about 1 million tons of copper, which we export. And at the current rates of $6,000 per ton, that's $6 billion. And you add another 2 billion of non-copper exports, which are exports of cement, sugar, livestock products, agriculture products, horticulture, and agriculture products. That's $8 billion a year of exports. If you translate this into export earnings per day, which is dividing the $8 billion by 365 days of the year, it works out at about $22 million a day in income, in revenue for the nation. Now, if we could harness this revenue, it would recapitalize our economy. And in my opinion, within the next 10 to 15 years, we would eradicate debt completely, especially the toxic debt. And we would have an economy which is not dependent on the 8 or 10 major foreign investors in the mining industry. We would have an economy that is sitting on economic activity of mainly Zambian-owned businesses who would have grown their businesses from the $22 million that is coming in every day into our economy in the next 10 to 20 years. And this money would just be building Zambian companies and growing Zambian companies to take over that space of supporting the domestic economy.